Let's just continue on where we left off, the Shamatha chart. Just a few more things I'd like to add that you might find useful. So this is the sort of standard model that we often see in terms of describing the stages of progress in the Shamatha practice, this 9-stage model. So we have these 9 stages, and Shamatha is the diagram in the middle at the top, and we'll talk about that shortly. And what we've seen here is that the elephant, of course, is the mind. The fact that it is black is symbolizing dullness. The monkey is discursive conceptual thought in general. The fact that the black color is the excitement. And what we see here is over these stages is that we are using, of course, introspection, quality to control, to monitor our attention, to monitor the mindfulness, noticing if we're becoming dull or distracted and then correcting it. And that by the time we get to stage 4, now our mindfulness and introspection are getting quite well developed to the point where we never completely lose the object anymore, but still we need a lot of work to do on the quality of our attention. And so that's what we're doing over these middling stages, constantly fine-tuning our focus, fine-tuning any hint of subtle agitation, subtle dullness, more and more finer levels we're overcoming. So much so that where we left off here at stage 8, now all we need to do is put a little bit of effort to start the meditation, and then our meditation runs flawlessly for long periods of time without any hint of subtle agitation or dullness. Stage 9, we see here now the meditator, an elephant to the mind in the cave. Now the whole thing becomes completely spontaneous, that we can slip in and out of meditation seamlessly, and we can stay in this sort of flawless meditative state for at least 4 hours at a time, no problems. But still we haven't achieved Shamatha. And what we need to do to get from stage 9 to Shamatha, which is in the middle at the top here, is what happens is that there is a radical transition in the body and the mind. We achieve what's called physical and mental pliancy. So to describe this process of how we go from stage 9 to Shamatha, it's very nicely described here in this book from Alan Wallace, Attention Revolution, on page 155. He says the following. Following the realization of the 9th stage of attentional balance, you are primed to achieve Shamatha. The 9 preceding stages entail many incremental changes, but the actual accomplishment of Shamatha involves a radical transition in your body and mind. You will be like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. This shift is characterized by specific experiences that take place within a discrete, relatively brief period of time. According to accounts from the Indo-Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, the first sign of achievement of Shamatha is the experience of a sense of heaviness and numbness on the top of the head. This allegedly happens to anyone who experiences this transition, regardless of the specific method followed. It is said to feel as if a palm were being placed on the top of your head. It is not unpleasant or harmful, just unusual. Something remarkable must be taking place in the cortical region of your brain at this point, but so far no one has monitored the brain correlates of this shift using magnetic resonance imaging or an electroencephalograph. This physical sensation on the top of the head is symptomatic of a shift in your nervous system or network of vital energies that is correlated with gaining freedom from mental dysfunction, a general state of mental imbalance characterized by stiffness, rigidity, and unwieldiness. Consequently, you achieve a state of mental pliancy in which your mind is fit and supple like never before. From a contemplative perspective, when the mind is dysfunctional or prone to laxity and excitation, or in other words, dullness and distraction, it is hard to generate enthusiasm for healing the afflictions of your mind or for devoting yourself to virtuous mental activity. Once you are free of such mental dysfunction, you can focus your mind without resistance on any meaningful object or task. And such a mind is now set to be fit or serviceable. This is the key to achieving optimal mental performance. So this mental pliancy is symbolized by the meditator riding on the elephant of the mind, meaning now we can turn our mind to whatever we want without any resistance whatsoever. Then he goes on, he says, following this sense of pressure on the top of your head, you experience the movement of vital energies moving in your body. And when they have coursed everywhere throughout your body, you feel as if you are filled with the power of this dynamic energy. You are now free of physical dysfunction, so your body feels buoyant and light like never before. And that's symbolized by here the person flying through the sky. It's said that when we achieve shamatha, our body feels light like cotton. Both your body and mind are now imbued with an exceptional degree of pliancy, which makes them remarkably fit for engaging in all kinds of mental training and other meaningful activities. When physical pliancy initially arises, the vital energies catalyze an extraordinary sense of physical bliss, which then triggers an equally exceptional experience of mental bliss. This rush of physical and mental rapture is transient, which is a good thing, for it so captivates the attention you can do little else except enjoy it. Gradually it subsides and you are freed from the turbulence caused by this intense joy. Your attention settles down in perfect stability and clarity. You have now achieved shamatha. Sounds pretty good, but we've got one last diagram here at the top right-hand corner. So now we see the meditator on the elephant of the mind, and in their right hand is a sword. This is a sword of wisdom. So this is symbolizing vipassana practice. And here we have two numbers, 32 and 33. So if we go over the page and have a look, there it says, the root of samsara is cut by the union of shamatha and vipassana observing emptiness. Equipped with mindfulness and introspection, seek the correct view of emptiness. So emptiness, of course, is the view of reality according to Buddhism, that nothing exists independently. So what this is saying is that on the basis of shamatha, now we can effectively engage in our vipassana practice to cut through our ignorance, using the sword of wisdom, to cut through our distorted view of reality, to come to realize the nature of reality, to overcome all mental afflictions and suffering. What this doesn't mean, of course, is that first we need to achieve shamatha before we begin vipassana practice. If we think like that, we'll be waiting a long time before we begin vipassana practice. But what it does mean is that if we don't do some shamatha practice, and then we just jump straight into vipassana practice, I think you'll find it's not going to work. You're just going to be distracted and half asleep. You can spend a lot of time in vipassana practice and not really get anywhere. So what it's saying is that we need to, as it says, we need to unify the two. In fact, what you will find is each one of those practices helps the other. Because the more shamatha practice we do, then when we go into vipassana practice, the more focused we are, the more we'll be able to penetrate nature of reality. The more we penetrate the nature of reality, that starts to reduce our mental afflictions a little bit. That's going to be helpful for shamatha practice, because mental afflictions like craving, attachment, jealousy, anger interfere with shamatha practice. So if we start to cut them a little bit with vipassana, that's going to help shamatha, which means shamatha can go deeper, which means then vipassana will be able to cut deeper. So they'll help support each other. So we need to unify them. A lot more to be said, but I think that's enough for the context of today's topics. Any last questions on this before we move on to the next shamatha practice? Yeah.
Where does everyday life come into this? Like if, say you're riding the metro, and where are you still practicing shamatha there?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in the last session today, but a brief answer, of course, is practice means meditation plus integrating into daily life. How we're going to do that with shamatha, we'll look at in the last session today.
Image 33 shows a flame which
Right.
vanished and has come back.
Correct. Very good point. So now, this is vipassana practice. So now we need to again put effort to investigate the nature of reality. So that's why the flame is back.
It's back because of the vipassana. We have to
Yeah,
know
this is vipassana.
Right.
So we need to put effort to investigate nature of reality.
Could you please repeat point number 14? Number 14. The rabbit one.
Oh, the rabbit. Yeah. So the rabbit is symbolizing subtle dullness. And from stage 3, we really need to pick that up. I mean, the rabbit was there from the beginning. But in stage 1 or 2, we had much more serious problems to worry about than a little bit of subtle dullness. But from stage 3, it starts to become an issue. That's why you see it from stage 3. And subtle dullness is where we're focusing on the object quite well, but our mind is not sharp or clear. It's sinking. It's sinking. And actually, that state is quite pleasant because the mind tends to be quite quiet, peaceful, and we go, oh, wow, I'm really close to shamatha. But actually, what's happening is we're sinking. Our mind is sinking. So we need to pick that up and we need to address that. Otherwise, we'll get stuck at stage 3. So that's why it's from stage 3.
So a lot of times you'll realize that you're probably at step 19 or stage 4, and then very suddenly next day you are at the stage 1, right?
Right, okay.
That tends to happen.
So the question here is, how do we know if we're at a particular stage? Like, for example, in stage 3, we said for stage 3, you can focus on the object maybe 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and if you get distracted, you quickly come back. But maybe now, in one meditation, that's happening. But that doesn't mean we're at stage 3. To be at stage 3 means that is our normal experience. On average, that's our experience in shamatha practice, that normally we're focusing on the object 5 or 10 minutes at a time. If we get distracted, quickly come back. Some days, maybe we can focus on it the entire session, never lose it. On other days, we lose it a bit more. But if that is our average experience, that's what it means to be at a particular stage. So you can have peak experiences and experiences that are lower from day to day, but that is talking about the average experience.
What is the significance of the cave, the meditation
I don't know.
cave at that point? Because if you've already achieved the stability of your mind,
You can lose it.
why do you...
You can lose it. So even at stage 9, if you were to stop practicing, you would slowly go backwards. It's a little bit like going to the gym. If we go to the gym and we achieve a certain level of fitness, if we stop going to the gym, do we stay there? No. But to maintain that level, we need to do a minimum level of activity to maintain. To go further, we need more. So similarly, even at stage 9, if we were suddenly to stop practice, which we wouldn't do because we see the benefit, but if we happen to do that, we would slowly go backwards. So you'll find the potential for imbalances to arise is still there at stage 9. Why the cave symbolism, I've never seen any instruction on that, I don't know.
Could you slightly elaborate more this mental pliancy? I mean, this whole idea of the pliancy, the physical and the...
Yeah. Mental pliancy just means...
When do we really say that, yes, I think the mind or the body is in the pliancy state?
So pliancy, what you'll notice as you move along, even at these sort of middling stages, you'll notice it's not like there's 0 pliancy and then 100% pliancy. There's a gradient. So even in these middling stages, you'll start to notice that. You'll notice that your mind there's much less resistance in your mind than normal. Your body doesn't seem to create so many problems as normal. So this is a gradual process. But what we're saying here is that when we move from stage 9 to shamatha, there's actually, because subtle energies are really completely balancing, that takes that pliancy to a whole new level. And it's much more sustainable from that point. Whereas earlier, you'll have these sort of experiences in a lesser degree, but you probably quickly lose them as well. You know, one day you have little resistance in mind. Next day your mind is resisting practice. You know, it'll come and go. But here it's really much more stable and lasting.
Mm-hmm. No, I really want you to understand this when we're really talking about the subtle energy in balance, which really bring that pliancy. could you really elaborate that more? Because the gross level it's easy to understand.
Ah.
But when we are really talking of the shamatha at the ninth level, the beyond, so it's the energy which is really working on that.
No.
No.
You're not, in shamatha, you're never focusing on energy directly.
But that is
The-
the state of the energy.
But the energy
It's
balancing
subtle.
is a side effect.
Okay.
It's a side effect. We're not doing, in shamatha practice, we're not doing directly any subtle body work, subtle energy work. That, in Buddhism, you find in Tantra.
Yeah.
So that can take it to a whole nother level. Because here, energy balancing is just a side effect of this practice. Whereas in Tantra, particularly completion stage practice, we are directly manipulating subtle energy to a much deeper level than happens here. This is very superficial balancing of subtle energy. And this is only a side effect. It's not something we're consciously doing.
Where is awareness here?
Again, as I mentioned yesterday evening, awareness is used by different translators to mean different things. So it really depends when you say, where is awareness here? What do you mean by the word awareness?
Yeah, I want to understand. See, the monkey, the elephant, are these, different entities and awareness different?
No,
And
that's
who is
all.
aware? Who is thinking?
I mean, these are
Who is
different.
correcting what?
These are different aspects of the mind. So when we talk about mind, and sometimes when we use the word awareness, it simply means mind.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes when we use the word awareness, or some people use the word awareness, they mean this introspection. Sometimes people mean the function of the mind. The mind knows, it is aware. So they use the word awareness to be a verb, to be an activity of the mind. So it depends really how you use the word awareness. But no matter how we use the word awareness, it's an aspect of the mind. It's not like they're separate entities.
Okay, and this thought and mind, they are separate? Thought comes to the mind from externally?
No.
Okay.
So these are all aspects of the mind. I mean, thoughts only appear in the mind. They're not coming from outside. You know? But this is a whole other topic of Buddhist psychology, so that's a whole different thing.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Regarding vipassana, in the last stage,
Yeah.
the ultimate aspect of vipassana, is it the non-conceptual realization, meditation on emptiness?
yeah, that's what we saw here on 32 and 33. The union of shamatha and vipassana observing emptiness. Yeah, exactly. In the Mahayana Buddhist tradition.
What is the key difference between the Samatha and Vipassana?
I didn't hear, sorry.
Samatha and Vipassana.
Difference between?
Shamatha and
Vipassana. So in shamatha, remember shamatha is simply cultivating a calm, clear, focused mind. Soon as we introduce any questioning, we're in vipassana. So in shamatha, there's no questioning. So if you are observing the mind and then suddenly you go, who's doing this? You've already moved into vipassana practice. You're not doing shamatha anymore. So in shamatha, we're not interested in answering any of these questions. All we're doing is we're trying to cultivate our attention skills, develop single-pointed attention. Then on that basis, then we start to question, investigate. Then we're vipassana. So the difference is, are we questioning and investigating or not? If we are, we're in vipassana. If we're not, then it's shamatha. That's the difference. So Goenka does, it's called a 10-day Vipassana retreat, but actually technically that's incorrect. Because for the first 3 or 4 days there's zero Vipassana. It's anapanasati, you're focusing here at the nostrils. You're not investigating anything. So actually the first 3 or 4 days in that retreat is shamatha. Then the next 5 days is Vipassana. Because then you're scanning the body to notice, to see the reality of the body, to investigate, to see that actually everything in the body is changing moment by moment, impermanence. So that is Vipassana. But anapanasati for the first 3 or 4 days is shamatha.
It's mentioned here, this is accomplished with the 6 powers which I found, and the 4 mental engagements.
Yeah, well, that's another topic and
Okay.
it's beyond today. I mean, yeah.
You mentioned the point that sometimes you find solutions to problems when you. So it often happens with me, and I find that as an incentive to go into meditation. So how do I correct this? Because I hang on.
Motivation. In fact, if you have that motivation, then there's some craving,
Yes.
which means actually your meditation is not going to go very well. So if you really want this to happen, you need to drop it. You need to drop wanting that to happen. Because wanting it to happen is going to stop it from happening.
Wow.
Really. Because wanting it means you're craving it.
Yes.
Craving is agitating the mind. The only way that this stuff will come up is if you let go of that. Let go of it. And the key is, we're not doing this practice to have these experiences. They're a little side effect. We're doing this practice to develop a calm, clear, focused mind, so we can use that in Vipassana practice, so that we can overcome mental afflictions and suffering and help people around us do likewise. If we keep that motivation in mind, then that'll...
Then it's okay when it arrives.
Yeah, sure.
It was not intentional, it arrives, but since I had that taste, then my mind went that.
Of course. And then, of course, it won't come again because you're craving it. So you need to let go of that. Rather than craving that, use that experience as a signpost that your practice is going in a good direction. And so use that very experience to go deeper in the practice and not go, oh, I want that. Then the whole practice will come to a grinding halt. Okay, let's go back to the next practice. So what I want to do now is focus at the entrance of the nostrils. So when we say to focus at the entrance of the nostrils, we're talking about either focusing at the actual entrance of the nostrils or this little area above the upper lip. So anywhere in this area here, whatever you find easier. Some people find the actual entrance easier. Some people find this little area here easier. Now, two things to watch out for in this practice. We're bringing the attention up, and of course it's a much smaller area of focus. So there can be a tendency to do one of two things. One is, because it's a little bit more difficult to focus here, our natural tendency is to tighten. So keep a watch for that. Particularly keep a watch for around the eyes, because often when we tighten, we tense around the eyes and the forehead. So if you notice any tension here, or particularly the neck, then release. So stay relaxed. The other tendency can be that because in the beginning maybe it's difficult to pick up sensations here, what we do is we force the breath, we breathe heavier. So we don't want to do that either. Just let the breathing flow naturally and just stay there, pay closer attention without the tension. That's all. Similarly, bear attention. So we're focusing on the actual sensations here. We're not imagining the breath coming in, going down, coming up, going out. That's a different practice. We're just noticing sensations here. And also, in this practice, like the previous, if you find yourself getting heavily distracted and you find counting helpful, then you can bring it in. So you can bring in a bit of counting if you want, if you find it helpful. If you're not, leave it out. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do a 15-minute practice, focusing at the sensations of breath at the entrance of the nostrils. So let's do that practice. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And preparing the mind, setting it into a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. Now narrow your focus and focus on the sensations of the breath at the entrance of the nostrils. So focusing either at the actual entrance of the nostrils or the small area above the upper lip, whichever you find more easy. And focusing on the sensations of the breath as it flows across this area. Keeping all the muscles in the face soft and relaxed. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly, not trying to force or control the breath in any way. If you find yourself heavily distracted, and if you find it helpful, you might like to introduce some counting the breath to help stabilize the attention. Any questions about that practice?
I'm asked to, focus the breath here. Honestly, I never feel any sensation. Is it because my mind is agitated? Is it too subtle? I can feel the stomach one. I have no sensation here. I don't know.
Yes, that's a very common experience. And it can be for a number of reasons. One, of course, the most common reason, of course, is our mind is not very focused and clear. It's not like there's no sensations here. It's just that we don't notice them because our mind is either caught up in lots of other things or it's very dull. So then basically, if that's the case, what we don't want to do, as I mentioned, is we don't want to tighten and we don't want to force the breath. We just patiently stay there, paying closer and closer attention without the tightening. Just stay there and pay close attention. And if you do that, then you'll notice, something there. And just keep watching. And then as your mind becomes more stable and more clear, you'll pick up more and more sensations. So just be patient with that. It takes time.
So basically, I'm having cold. So I can just feel it in just my left nostril.
Sure. Then that's what you feel. That's fine. No
And
problem.
more precisely on the out breath. That's
Yeah, I mean, what you feel is what you feel, and it'll change depending on what's going on in the body, of course. That's fine. It's okay.
Do you recommend eyes closed or half open?
That's a point I'm going to talk about now, but a short answer is the general recommendation for meditation in general is to have them slightly open. But I think as a beginner, because otherwise eyes closed for us, we associate with sleep. So we close our eyes, we get very dull. But here as a beginner, I think we can be flexible depending on the type of person we are. Some people are naturally tend to be more dull than agitated. So for those people, I wouldn't recommend meditating with eyes closed. You're just going to get dull. Other people, however, tend to be more agitated than dull generally. And then maybe having the eyes open with more light, they get even more agitated. So for those people, maybe as a beginner, eyes closed is better. So that's something you can experiment with in the beginning stages. But you probably will find that as you get deeper into the practices, that having the eyes closed will promote some dullness, at least subtle dullness. So probably you'll find later that you will need to open the eyes slightly. But as a beginner, you can experiment, see what works best for you. For the practice we're going to do now, eyes open is very much recommended. So let's go to that practice. Yeah.
This is regarding your comment in the last question answer. Impermanence and emptiness are two different things.
Yes and no.
Yes, I understand why you are saying no also. But when you said Goenkaji's technique of looking at impermanence later, that is vipassana. So
sure.
Emptiness and in that sense it is emptiness and impermanence are both vipassana.
So vipassana just means insight, and we can, often people who have only ever done a Goenka retreat equate vipassana with scanning body. Scanning body is one of many types of vipassana practice, and the scanning the body in that retreat is primarily to come to an insight into impermanence. So you can focus on many different objects to realize impermanence, and you can focus on the body to realize impermanence, to realize suffering, to realize no self, to realize emptiness, to realize all sorts of things. So there are many things we can focus on, and there are many different insights we can gain in Vipassana practice. But because Goenka's retreat is based in the Theravada tradition, and it's an entry-level retreat, then it's recommended first we start with the body, and first we start with the insight of impermanence. But that's just the beginning point of a whole range of Vipassana practices. Emptiness is much more emphasized in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions. Okay. Yeah.
Would you recommend a half smile, or some texts say you have a half smile?
If it's natural, sure, why not? We don't want to be straining the face in any way.
Yeah.
Right, so now, last night we talked about what object to use, and the general recommendation is pick the one that works best for you and stick with that. But in Alan Wallace's book, he also has another alternative which also can be effective. So let's see what he says. That's on page 6. To guide meditators along these 10 stages, and the 10 stages are the 9 plus Shamatha, I have chosen from Buddhist teachings 3 techniques that I have found effective for people in the modern world. These 3 techniques are the basis for the 3 divisions of this book. For the first 4 stages, you should practice whatever method you find easiest. By stage 5, the mind is relatively stable and you can move on to subtler techniques. For achieving the first 4 stages, I recommend the practice of mindfulness of breathing, variations of which can be found in Zen, Vipassana, and Tibetan Buddhism. Mindfulness of breathing means settling your awareness on the sensations involved in breathing, continually returning your attention there whenever your mind wanders. Beginning with the 5th stage, I recommend a method called settling the mind in its natural state. That's the practice we're going to do now. In this technique, you direct your attention to mental experiences. That is, all the events such as thoughts, mental images and emotions that arise in the domain of the mind. This method is drawn from the Dzogchen lineage, but is found in other Buddhist traditions as well. With the instructions for the 8th attentional stage onward, we move on to the still subtler practice of maintaining awareness of awareness itself. That's the practice we'll do after lunch. The technique is called Shamatha, without an object. Here the practice is not so much one of developing attentional stability and clarity as it is of discovering the stillness and luminosity inherent in awareness itself. The training in mindfulness of breathing may be helpful to anyone, including those seeking to prevent or treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. Many people find the second practice, that of settling the mind in its natural state, to be more challenging, but some meditators take to it naturally. Likewise, the practice of awareness is subtler still, but it may be optimal from the beginning for those who are strongly drawn to it. You may use any one of the 3 methods to progress along all 10 stages of attentional development, or you may follow the sequence described in this book. How fast you progress will depend on the level of your commitment and the degree to which your lifestyle and environment support such practice. So let's look at that second practice now. We're using the mind as the object. Here Alan Wallace calls this practice settling the mind in its natural state. So what is the object that we're focusing on here? The object that we're focusing on is the mind itself plus whatever mental events arise in the mind. And mental events include thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. So in this practice, what we're not focusing on is sense objects. So in this practice, we're not paying attention to sensations in the body, to sounds, to visual objects, smell or taste. Let them be there, we're just not interested in them. The only thing we're focusing on is mental events. Thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. In this practice, we're not trying to make the mind still. If you've ever tried to make the mind still, you know it doesn't work. And we're not trying to make the mind still in this practice. If the mind is still, i.e. if there's no thoughts there, just observe that stillness. If there's lots of thoughts there, just observe that. So whether there's lots of thoughts or no thoughts, both equally okay. In fact, in some ways, it's better to have thoughts than no thoughts, because if there's no thoughts, there's a great danger that we just sink into this very dull, blank state. At least if there's thoughts there's something to pay attention to. It keeps us alert. But whether there's thoughts there or no thoughts, both equally okay. So in this practice, the instruction is let thoughts be. In the breath practice, we had to let them go. If a thought came up, we let it go, come back to the breath. In this practice, let them be, meaning watch thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth as they arise and pass, without, of course, following them, without trying to get rid of them. And in this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open, either naturally or partially, whichever you prefer. And there are a number of reasons for this. First is that with the eyes closed, of course, it's easy to sink into dullness. With the eyes open, with some light coming in, it's easier to maintain clarity. Second reason is with the eyes closed, it's very easy to drift off into the past and the future. With the eyes open, it's much easier to stay in the present moment. Third reason, that in this practice, we're developing our ability to observe our thoughts, emotions, and so forth without getting caught up, without suppressing. But this is, of course, something we want to do in daily life as well. But if we only ever learn to watch our thoughts and emotions in meditation with eyes closed, then it's going to be hard to bring that into daily life. Because generally in daily life, we have our eyes open. And then we're not in the habit of observing thoughts and emotions with eyes open. So it's going to be much more difficult to do that in daily life. Whereas if we meditate with eyes open, observing thoughts and emotions, it's going to be much easier to do that, to bring that into daily life, because we have a habit of observing them with eyes open. That's the third reason. Fourth reason is with the eyes closed, there is often this strong sense there's a me in here and a world out there. There's a strong sense of subject-object duality. And in Vipassana practice, the Vipassana practice of emptiness, we're coming to realize, in fact, there is no subject-object duality. With the eyes open, that false sense of duality starts to break down. There's not such a strong sense of me in here, world out there. Which means if we meditate with eyes open in Shamatha, already this false sense of duality is starting to break down a little bit. Which means it's going to be helpful when we move into Vipassana practice to come to realize there's no duality. So these are the 4 reasons for having the eyes open. So again, in this, eyes open, either naturally or partially. When I say eyes open, of course, we're not looking at anything. But also, we're not trying to deliberately unfocus. Sometimes people try to deliberately unfocus. Then we're straining the eyes, so we don't want to do that. Just resting your gaze in the space in front of you, not looking at anything. A little bit like sometimes in daily life we're caught up in a daydream and our eyes are open. We're not really looking at anything, but the eyes are open. So like that, the eyes are open, but we're not really looking at anything because we're paying attention to our mind. Also, we're not trying to hold the eyes open. So blink as often as you need and just rest the gaze in the space in front of you. So that's the practice we're going to do now. Any questions about the practice? Anything not clear about the practice?
If you're observing your thoughts, how are you not thinking that, like, aren't you then thinking them and you're not observing?
Good question.
Only one or the other?
What's the difference between thinking about this pen and observing the thought about the pen? If we're thinking about the pen, what are we focusing on? The pen. If we're observing a thought about the pen, what are we focusing on? The thought. So if we're focusing on the content of the thought, we're grasping, we're lost, we're caught up. That's the difference. So this practice is not mindfully thinking about anything. Of course, mindfully thinking about things in daily life can be useful to go through some process. But here, we're simply observing the thought itself. Okay, let's do that practice. So we'll do a 15-minute practice. After the meditation, there's a few more things I want to add to the practice that you will find helpful, I think. But let's do the practice first. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not controlling or regulating the breath in any way. and preparing the mind, allowing it to come to rest in the present moment, and simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. And now allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed, blink as often as you need. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Observing any thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images that are arising in the mind, without following them, without trying to get rid of them. Simply be like an impartial observer or witness, observing thoughts and other mental events as they arise and pass. If you're new to this practice and you're not sure where to focus, then every now and again deliberately generate a thought. Any thought will do. And watch that thought as it arises in your mind, and then watch it as it disappears back into the mind. And then keep your attention right where it was and see what comes up next in that space. If you find that you've got caught up in a thought and got carried away, remember, first thing to do is relax. Then release grasping onto that thought and very gently return to observing the mind. So relax, release and return. Keep coming back to the mind again and again. If you're becoming frustrated at not being able to observe your thoughts, observe that frustration. Or if you're becoming bored with the practice, observe that boredom. Whatever is arising in the mind, observe it. Just a few more comments about that practice and then maybe a little bit of Q&A before we finish or break for lunch. One of the most common experiences when we begin this practice is that we're constantly carried away. Some thought, emotion, memory, something comes up and off we go. Because that is our strong habit. And of course when this happens then, the thing to do is, as we've been doing with all distractions in this retreat, in this day, is relax, release, return. So when you notice you've got caught up in a thought or some memory or something, then relax, let go of that and come back. Let go, come back, let go, come back. Same. It's normal. But there are some temporary short-term strategies that we can introduce to help us to get into the practice. And one of those is a little bit like counting the breath. We can do what's called labeling or noting. So when some mental event arises, give it a name. Because if you give it a name, then you're focusing on that mental event and you're not focusing on the content of it. So if a thought about something comes up, don't label thought about nasty person, because then you're still focusing on the person. So rather, whatever the content of the thought is, just go label thought. Or if it's an image that comes up, go image. If it's a particular memory that comes up, memory. So label, but don't label what the content of that mental event is, because then we're likely to get caught up in that. So just give a label to the actual mental event itself. What is it? Is it a thought? Is it irritation? Is it a memory? Is it an image? Just give a simple label. Because if we label, then we're focusing on the event rather than getting caught up in the contents. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing we can do is we can anchor in the breath. Meaning if we're constantly getting caught up in our thoughts, go back into the body and focus on the breath. Any one of those variations we've done. The full body, the rhythm, the abdomen, nostrils. Actually for this, the rhythm of the breath is very good because it's very helpful for relaxation. So just focus on the sensations of the breath, any one of those variations. Have that as your main object. So you're anchoring yourself in that. And then a little bit in the corner of the mind, notice your thoughts and emotions. But you're mainly focusing on the breath. That's your anchor. Once you've done that a little bit, then you can less focus on the breath and start to focus more on the mental event. So you can move from mostly the breath to then mostly the mind, and then eventually let go of the breath altogether. So you can use the breath as like a transition to get into the practice. So that's another thing you can do. And another thing you can do is what we did in this practice just now, is that if we're just constantly getting swept away all the time, it can be very discouraging. We go, oh, I can't do this practice at all. So what we can do then is what we did a little bit in the practice now is every so often deliberately generate a thought. Because our thoughts don't announce themselves. They don't say, here I come, be ready. Before we know it, it's there, and before we know it, we're already gone. Whereas if we're deliberately generating a thought, we know it's coming. We're prepared. And we can watch that thought as it arises in our mind and watch it disappear. So then we can have a little bit of feeling of success. So you can do this every now and again just to get yourself into the practice. But all of these three here, we're adding something. So this is not part of the normal practice, but like counting the breath, it could be an effective short-term strategy to help us to get into the practice. So we may, as a beginner, use one or more of these things to help us to get into the practice, but then at some point we'll need to let go of all of this because we're adding something. But to help us to get into the practice, these can be useful. So this is the most common experience. We just get swept away all the time. But there's actually another common experience we have as a beginner. And that is no thoughts. We sit down, we look, and then suddenly there's nothing there. But generally as a beginner, that's not because our mind has suddenly become very quiet and still. Probably the most common reason for this experience as a beginner is is that our focus is too intense. Because our habit is, whenever we focus on anything in our life, we tense. And particularly here, we know we've got a strong habit of getting caught up. So our strong habit is when we look, we tense. And if we're really tensing when we're looking at the mind, we're suffocating the mind. There's no space for anything to come up. So if you notice your focus is very intense, relax, 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 relax. Another reason why we can have this no thought experience as a beginner is we're lacking clarity. A little bit like just the previous practice we did, focusing at the nostrils as a beginner. Often we don't notice any sensations there at all. But that's not because there's no sensations there, it's because we're lacking clarity. So similarly here, what we find is that because our mind is not very clear, there's actually a lot of mental things going on, but it's below our threshold, our radar. It's all sort of what's called subconscious or unconscious things are going on. So therefore, just stay there and pay attention more closely, without, of course, tensing. Just pay closer attention. And the more that our clarity improves, the more we'll start to notice a lot of this subtle mental activity that we don't notice now. Then there's another experience as well. And that is, we sit down and we look and we go, there's no thoughts. What's going on? Normally my mind is full of thoughts, but now it's gone completely quiet and still. I think I must be doing something wrong. I don't know what I'm doing in this practice because my mind is completely still now. All thoughts. All thoughts. All thoughts. Or if we're sitting and we're getting frustrated, frustration is a mental event. We're sitting, we're getting bored. Boredom is a mental event. Just observe all of these things. And then lastly, that if there really is no thought there, then it doesn't mean switch off, but observe that empty space of the mind. Observe that stillness. So we're continue with mindfulness. So again, the object here is not just mental events, but also the space in which they arise. So if there's no mental events arising, then just observe that space. Any questions about this practice? Yeah.
Could you explain that labeling, noting piece? For example, let's say you start thinking about if you've got a flight to catch.
Yeah, then you go thought. Just go thought. Don't say thought about flight, because then you're engaging in the object of the thought. So don't go, like if some worry about missing a flight's coming up, don't label worried about missing flight. Not a good idea. Just go, well, you can go thought or you can go worry, anxiety, memory. Don't label what it's about. Just the type of mental event.
And let go.
Or just watch it. I mean, you don't need to push it away. So in this practice, we're not trying to manipulate, we're not trying to get rid of. But this labeling can help avoid getting caught up into what it's about. So if you're worried about missing a flight, just go anxiety. Worry. That's it.
Also, you talked about not getting dragged into the past or the future, but at the same time, a memory could be about the past.
Right, then just go memory. Just go memory. Don't say memory about such and such, because then we're caught up in it. Just go memory.
There's another question, not related to this particular meditation practice. I do sense heartbeat, but in the back of my spine, like the lower part of the spine.
But,
so I'm more on the left side, so what? Isn't
well, in this practice, we're not paying attention to anything in the body. So,
not in this practice, but like general meditation.
Yeah, and that's, as our mindfulness improves, our clarity will improve, and then you're going to start to notice all sorts of things going on in the body that we've never noticed before in our entire life. So use that as a sign that our clarity is improving. But whatever the practice is, stick to that practice. So if that experience comes up in this practice, just ignore it. Don't try and block it. Don't get caught up in it. Just let it be there and just focus on the practice. But if it comes, just go, okay, that's good. I mean, my clarity is improving. Good. Let's keep going. Let's keep practicing. Yeah.
Can you elaborate more on the last point, observe space?
Yeah. So the space of the mind. So when we're observing, it's the analogy we often use here is the mind is like the sky and the thoughts are like clouds moving through the sky. So using that analogy, what we're observing in this practice is we're observing the sky of the mind plus all the clouds of thoughts arising. So if there's no clouds there, we're just observing that sky. So if there's no thoughts, we're observing the space of the mind.
My issue is that whenever I become aware of the thoughts, they disappear.
Very good. Excellent. Excellent.
So that isn't an issue.
No, it means you're practicing well. Because if you're not observing the thought, you're getting caught up, they'll stay there. So the fact that they're going like this is good sign. Very good. Excellent.
I will tell you shortly about my experience in this last 2 sessions. So when I'm trying to focus on my breath and my thoughts, immediately, if my eye sense is not at one particular object, I get easily distracted. So is it okay to focus on both the breath and the visual object?
Yeah, okay. Right. So again, here with this practice, but also breath practice, we may have the eyes open. Of course, here is not ideal conditions to meditate with eyes open because there's people in front of you moving. And for many of us, our dominant sense is visual. And I think this probably is, due to evolution, we need to look out for danger, Any movement, danger. But when we go home, we can adjust our environment. So if you're meditating with eyes open at home, I wouldn't recommend having lots of stuff in front of you. Do not have certainly like a flickering candle or any movement because that will attract your attention immediately. So best have a blank wall so there's nothing for the visual to get hold of. And if you get a little bit more agitated, dim the lighting. I like very dark. In fact, I like to meditate in completely dark room. Then there's nothing to grab your visual attention. So that's something you can do at home. If you're in an environment such as this, where you can't control that because there's people moving and that, as a temporary measure, what can be helpful is pick a spot in front of you on the floor or something and use that as an anchor point. It's better to have that rather than the eyes doing all of this. Of course, ideally, you're not even really looking at anything, but that would be better than getting that. So in this sort of environment, if you find that the eyes are moving around everywhere, pick a spot and use that as an anchor point. But at home, blank wall, dark, nothing to look at. Best.
Is emotion also mental?
Yeah. So in this practice, actually in the text, how it's usually translated into English, it says observe your thoughts. But actually what's translated as thought in English in Tibetan is tokpa. And tokpa literally means conceptual activity. So that actually includes emotions, memories, mental images. This is all tokpa, but often it's translated as thought. So people mistakenly think, oh, I'm only observing thoughts. I'm not observing emotions, memory. No, that's not true. Not correct in this practice. We're observing all mental events. Right down the back. Then we break for lunch.
If there is no memory, there won't be any thought. Aren't these thoughts all memory?
No, you can have new thoughts. I mean, like if for example, if something newly arises, we try to conceptualize sense objects. Of course, we're drawing on our past concepts, but we are newly generating some concept about what we experience. So not necessary, but of course, we're drawing heavily on our memories in terms of all of our conceptual activity, because our conceptual activity is something that we develop over time based on past experiences. But
because my reflection just now, whatever images were coming or thoughts were coming, they were all associated. They were jumping from one to other, but there was association of. There was an association on those.
Right. So this is the last point, then we need to break for lunch. What you will find, of course, is that if we're not really observing and something comes up, we're off on a story, completely lost. It's only later we go, oh, hang on, where am I? Then we're completely lost. If we start to be able to step back and watch a little bit, what you'll find in the next phase is we're not completely lost. There's still somewhat of a story unfolding, but we're not completely caught up in it. We're sort of a little bit caught and we're a little bit out. That's what you're describing, is that there seems to be a train of thought going on, but we're not completely immersed in it. So that's already a sign that we're managing to step back a little bit. Because if we're completely caught up, we're lost. But then if you keep practicing and you'll find that you step back even more, you'll find there won't really be even a thread. There'll just be a lot of random things that are not disconnected at all. But already what you're experiencing is already an improvement of the normal case where we're just completely lost in our story. So that is a sign that we're heading in the right direction in the practice. So we need to break there for lunch. So let's break there for lunch. We'll come back at 2:30 and we'll continue this practice, and we'll also then introduce the next practice in the next session, that one of resting in awareness.